She pointed at her scars and asked if anyone would ever choose her. Lyra stood at the edge of the ruined city, the wind biting at her skin, carrying with it the smell of ash and decay. The once thriving metropolis now lay in ruins, a shadow of its former self. Buildings that had once been towering monuments to human achievement were now nothing more than crumbling skeletons. The streets, once filled with bustling crowds, were now empty, silent except for the occasional sound of debris shifting in the wind. Her eyes scanned the desolate landscape as her fingers brushed against the jagged scar running down her left arm. It was a mark that would never fade, a reminder of everything she had lost. The scar wasn't just physical. It represented everything that had been taken from her home, her family, and the world she once knew. She had been just a girl when the invaders arrived, an innocent, hopeful girl who had no idea that her life would be torn apart in an instant. The aliens had come with their ships, sleek and cold, their weapons unlike anything Earth had ever seen. They didn't come to conquer, they came to experiment. Lyra had been one of many humans taken for testing. She had been subjected to their cruel experiments, their cold, unfeeling hands altering her body in ways she never imagined. The scars on her body were just the most visible evidence of their torture. But it wasn't just her body they had scarred her mind as well. For years, she had been a prisoner in a world she no longer recognized. The invaders had stripped away her humanity, using her like an object to study and manipulate. But she survived. She survived the tests, the pain, the isolation. She had been among the few humans left alive after the invasion, but she often wondered if surviving had been a curse rather than a blessing. Lyra pulled her coat tighter around her body, the cold seeping into her bones. She had been walking for hours, lost in thought, when she finally came upon the ruins of her old home. It was barely recognizable now, the familiar streets now a labyrinth of twisted metal and broken stone. But there, in the middle of the wreckage, she could still see the faint outline of the place she had once called home. She knelt down, her hand resting on the cracked pavement, the memory of her childhood flooding back. She had been a different person then, innocent, full of dreams. Her family had been ordinary, just like everyone else. They had lived in a small house on the edge of the city, close to the woods. Her father had been a mechanic, and her mother worked as a teacher. They had been content, and for a while it had felt like nothing could ever take that happiness away. But then the invaders arrived. Lyra's mind snapped back to the present, her fingers digging into the cold stone as she forced herself to stand. There was no time for nostalgia, no time for dwelling on the past. The world had changed, and so had she. She was no longer that innocent girl. She had grown stronger, more resilient, but the scars, both visible and hidden, remained. Her hand reached up to her face, tracing the scar that ran across her cheek, a thin, pale line that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. It was the most noticeable of all her scars, the one that people always seemed to focus on when they saw her. She often wondered if people saw her scars before they saw her. Did they see the disfigurement and recoil in fear? Did they pity her? She didn't know. She had never let anyone get close enough to ask. Lyra shook her head, trying to rid herself of the dark thoughts. She didn't have time for self-pity. The world was still a dangerous place, and she was no longer the scared girl who had once hidden in the shadows. She had a mission, something far greater than her own struggles. As she moved through the ruins, her thoughts turned to the future. She had joined a group of survivors, those who had managed to escape the initial wave of the invasion. They were scattered, living in small, isolated communities, hiding from the invaders who had all but destroyed Earth. But there were whispers of something bigger, a resistance, a chance to strike back, to take Earth back from the alien invaders. Lyra had heard the rumors, but she had never believed them. After everything she had been through, it seemed impossible. But then she met Kale. Kale was different. He wasn't like the others. He was an alien, a member of a race that had been fighting the invaders for years. Unlike most of his kind, Kale had a deep respect for humanity. He had seen what the invaders had done to her people, and he was determined to help them rise again. Lyra had met him just a few days ago, when she had been sent to scavenge supplies in the ruins of the old city. He had appeared out of nowhere, his alien features striking against the backdrop of the crumbling buildings. At first, she had been wary of him, unsure of his intentions. But he had spoken to her in a way that no one else had ever done before, not as a victim, not as someone broken, but as an equal. He had asked her about her scars, not with pity but with curiosity. He had wanted to know what they meant to her, what they represented. And for the first time in years, Lyra had found herself talking about them, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something that had shaped who she was. Cale had told her that the scars on her body were not just marks of pain, they were marks of survival. He saw them as symbols of her strength, her resilience. They were reminders of everything she had endured and everything she had overcome. He had spoken with such conviction, such sincerity, that Lyra had started to believe him. Maybe she wasn't just a survivor. Maybe she was something more, but even as she tried to believe his words, doubts lingered in the back of her mind. Would anyone ever choose her? Could she ever truly be loved, scars and all? She had spent so many years hiding from the world, afraid of what people would think of her, of what they would see when they looked at her. Could Cale's words really be true? Could she really be something more than just the girl with the scars? As she walked through the ruins, lost in her thoughts, Lyra didn't notice the figure approaching from behind until it was too late. A hand grabbed her arm, pulling her back with surprising strength. She spun around, ready to fight, but when she saw who it was, she froze. It was Cale. He looked at her, his expression softening when he saw the confusion in her eyes. "You're deep in thought," he said, his voice gentle. Lyra didn't know how to respond. She hadn't expected him to find her so quickly, but there he was standing before her, his eyes filled with understanding. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice trailing off. Cale nodded, his hand still resting lightly on her arm. "I know," he said quietly. "And I know what you're thinking about, your scars." Lyra's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you—" "I've been watching you," he said with a small smile. "I know you better than you think, and I know what you're afraid of." Lyra shook her head, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I'm not afraid," she said, though the words felt hollow. I don't know who I am anymore." Cale's hand moved to her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "You're still you, Lyra. Don't let the past define you. Your scars don't make you less than anyone else. They make you who you are, and that's enough." Lyra looked at him, her heart heavy with emotion. For the first time in years, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as broken as she thought. Lyra woke up to the sound of distant explosions. The world outside her small shelter was still dark, the faint light of the broken moon just visible through the cracked windows. She groaned softly and sat up, rubbing her eyes. The nights had become colder, the winds from the abandoned city carrying the chill of the desolate world. The planet was far from what it had once been. She looked around the room, bare except for a small cot, some salvaged supplies, and a pile of old papers she had been looking through the night before. The room wasn't much, but it was hers. A quiet place, away from the rest of the survivors. She had kept to herself in recent weeks, not fully trusting anyone to get close enough. Her mind often wandered back to the events of the last few days, her meeting with Cale. The alien warrior had shown up unexpectedly, and though Lyra had been cautious at first, something about him had drawn her in. Maybe it was his calm demeanor, his way of speaking without pity or judgment. He had looked at her like she wasn't defined by her scars. And for once, she hadn't felt like a victim. She had felt like someone important, a survivor. Cale had been insistent. He had offered her a place among the resistance, a group of warriors fighting back against the invaders who had left Earth in ruins. He believed that Earth could still rise again, and he wanted her by his side. Lyra still wasn't sure about the idea of joining the fight. The invasion had caused so much pain, and she didn't know if she was ready to step back into that kind of world. But there was something about Cale that made her think twice. He had seen her scars, her broken past, and yet he still believed in her. That belief, as small as it was, made her wonder if she could finally step beyond her doubts and become something more. She stood up, stretching her arms above her head, feeling the stiffness in her muscles. It had been a while since she'd really trained, and her body reminded her of that. Her scars often made simple movements feel like a struggle, a reminder of the trauma she had endured. But she had lived through it. Every day, every scar was proof that she was still here, still fighting in her own way. The sound of footsteps echoed outside her door, snapping her out of her thoughts. Lyra's hand instinctively went to the knife she kept on the table beside her. She was always prepared. She had learned the hard way that in a world like this, one could never let their guard down. The door creaked open slowly, and there stood Cale, his silhouette just visible in the dim light. She relaxed when she saw him, her grip on the knife loosening. "Are you ready?" Kale asked, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something else in his tone, something that made Lyra feel like today was going to be different. Lyra nodded, walking toward him. "Ready for what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "To train," he said simply. "You said you wanted to be part of the resistance. Today is the day we start." Lyra hesitated. She had promised herself she would think about it more before jumping in, but deep down she knew that part of her had already made the decision. There was no going back now. The world was in ruins, and it needed people like her, people who had been through hell and had survived. "Okay," she replied, her voice firm, though she still felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. Kale stepped aside, allowing her to walk past him. As they made their way through the dark corridors of the shelter, Lyra felt the eyes of the other survivors on her. They knew who she was. They knew her scars. They didn't say anything, but she could feel the weight of their gazes, the way they looked at her like she was different. She hated it. She hated feeling like an outsider, like a walking symbol of what had gone wrong. But Kale had told her that her scars made her strong. And maybe that was something she needed to start believing. Outside, the wind had picked up, the cold air biting at her exposed skin. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, the fabric worn from years of use. The once proud city stood before her, a broken monument to the world that had been lost. There was no beauty here, just destruction, and yet it felt like it was her world now. It had been the place where everything had started, and now it was a place where she could begin again. Kale led her to a small, makeshift training ground, surrounded by the remnants of the old world, twisted metal beams and shattered concrete. The air was thick with the scent of dust, the once strong smell of industry replaced with the stench of decay. Lyra looked around, taking in the scene. There were other survivors here, some practicing with weapons, others sparring with each other. They were all different races, different backgrounds, but they shared one thing in common, the desire to fight back. "You'll train with the others," Kale said, guiding her to a small group of people. "They've been through what you have. You'll learn from them." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the group. There was a woman with short black hair, a young man with a scar across his cheek, and an older man who looked like he had seen more battles than he cared to remember. They all stood in a loose circle, their eyes meeting hers briefly before they turned back to their training. Kale left her there, stepping back to give her space. She stood still for a moment, feeling a mix of anxiety and excitement rise inside her. She had never trained to fight before. She had never had to. But now, in this broken world, she had to learn. She had to become something more than just the girl with the scars. She had to prove that she was more than what had been done to her. The woman with short black hair stepped forward, offering Lyra a nod of acknowledgement. "You're here to learn," she said. "You're here to fight." Lyra nodded, swallowing her nerves. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The training was intense. Lyra struggled at first, her body not used to the movements, her scars pulling with each twist and turn. The others pushed her, encouraging her to keep going, to push through the pain. And she did. Slowly, with each movement, she began to feel stronger. The scars on her body didn't hurt as much when she moved them. They were a part of her, but they no longer controlled her. As the sun began to rise, casting an orange glow across the desolate landscape, Lyra found herself sitting on the ground, breathing heavily but smiling. She had done it. She had pushed through the pain, through the doubts, and now she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. She could be more than just the girl with scars. She could be part of something bigger. Kale approached her as the others continued to train. "You did well today," he said, his voice warm with approval. Lyra looked up at him, a glimmer of confidence in her eyes. "I'm not done yet," she replied. "I'll keep going, I have to." Kale smiled. "That's the spirit. You're ready for this. I knew it." Lyra stood up, wiping the sweat from her forehead. She felt stronger, more alive than she had in a long time. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. She was ready for whatever came next. Lyra's body ached from the intense training. She had been working harder than ever, pushing herself past her limits, and still, the doubts lingered at the back of her mind. Every day, she would fight, practice, and train until she couldn't move anymore. The others could see her determination, and she could see it in their eyes too: respect. But there was a nagging feeling she couldn't shake. The scars on her skin, the reminders of the torment she had endured at the hands of the invaders, felt heavier with each passing day. It was a quiet morning when Lyra decided to take a break. The others were out in the field, practicing hand-to-hand combat and weaponry. She, however, found a quiet corner, the soft sound of wind rustling the scattered papers and debris around her. Sitting against a broken wall, she allowed herself to catch her breath. Her fingers traced the scar running down her right arm. It wasn't just any scar, it was the most visible one, the one that was hardest to ignore. It had been the first one she had received when the invaders first captured her. They had experimented on her body, altering it in ways she couldn't understand. Her scars had always been a reminder of their cruelty, of everything she had lost. But over time, they had become part of her. She had learned to live with them. But today, for the first time, she felt something different. It wasn't anger or pain, but a strange sense of pride. Her scars were part of her survival, part of what made her who she was now. The thought made her feel something inside, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't broken beyond repair. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Cale approached her. He had been keeping his distance, giving her space to work through her emotions. He knew how hard it was for Lyra to come to terms with everything. But today, something about the way she sat, the way her shoulders weren't slumped, made him feel like it was time to speak. "Lyra," Cale's voice was steady, calm. "You've been working hard, I can see it. But you need to take a step back sometimes. You need to rest." Lyra didn't look up immediately, but she felt his presence, the weight of his gaze on her. She took a deep breath, standing up slowly. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice didn't sound convincing. "I can't afford to stop. If I stop, I'll lose everything. If I stop, I'll be the weak one again." Cale stepped closer, his eyes watching her carefully. "You are not weak, Lyra. You've been through more than most can imagine. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Lyra met his eyes then, the vulnerability she had tried to keep hidden showing through. "But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I can't do this? What if I'm just a reminder of everything that's wrong with this world?" Cale didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body against the chill of the air. He stood tall, but there was a softness in his posture that made her feel less alone. He spoke quietly, his words not demanding but gentle. "Lyra," he said, "your scars are not what define you. They are part of your past, yes, but they do not determine your future. What you do from here on out, that's what matters. You are more than just a survivor. You are a fighter." Her breath caught in her throat. "A fighter," she repeated, the word tasting unfamiliar on her tongue. "I don't even know who I'm fighting for anymore." Cale's eyes softened as he looked at her. "You're fighting for yourself. You're fighting for the future, for the people who are still here. Earth may be broken, but it's not gone yet. And neither are you." Lyra's heart beat a little faster as she absorbed his words. She had never thought about it that way before. Fighting for herself, she had always fought to survive, but had she ever fought to actually live? To live beyond the scars, beyond the pain? She turned away from Cale, looking out at the horizon, where the remnants of the ruined city met the broken sky. It was hard to imagine a world beyond the destruction, a world where people didn't fear the next attack. A world where Earth could be rebuilt, but maybe, just maybe, that was possible. Maybe it was worth fighting for. "I'm scared," Lyra admitted softly. "I don't know what's waiting for me out there. I don't know what it means to fight anymore." Cale didn't answer right away. He let her words sink in before he spoke again, his voice as steady as ever. "It's okay to be scared," he said. "Everyone who fights for something worthwhile is scared, but it's not the fear that matters, it's what you choose to do with it. You can let it control you, or you can use it to push yourself forward." Lyra nodded, though she still wasn't sure. But the fear wasn't as heavy as it had been before. There was something Cale said that stuck with her, the idea of choosing. She had always thought that fear controlled her, that her scars controlled her, that the invaders controlled her. But maybe it was time to choose something different. It was time to choose who she was going to be. Over the next few days, Lyra threw herself into her training with a renewed focus. She didn't allow herself to dwell on the past as much. When the others sparred, she joined in. When they practiced with weapons, she picked one up, learning the way it felt in her hands, how it could be used to protect herself. She still had a lot to learn, but she was determined to push forward, to become someone who didn't just survive but fought for something bigger than herself. One morning, after a long session of practice, Lyra was alone in the training grounds, her body sore from the exertion. The others had left for a mission, and she had stayed behind to continue her training. She was still struggling, but it felt different now. There was a purpose behind her movements, a reason to keep going. She was about to leave when Cale appeared again, his footsteps light against the cracked earth. He gave her a small smile, his eyes warm with approval. "You're improving," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. I can see the change in you. Lyra wiped the sweat from her brow, exhaustion pulling at her, but there was a fire inside her now, something that hadn't been there before. I'm not where I want to be yet, she said, her voice more confident than it had been in days. But I'm getting there, I'm not stopping. Kale's smile widened. That's the spirit. I knew you had it in you. Lyra met his gaze, the uncertainty that had once clouded her thoughts now replaced with something else, determination. I don't know what the future holds, she said, her voice steady, but I'm ready to fight for it. And for the first time in a long while, Lyra truly believed it. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for a chance to rebuild, to reclaim what had been taken from her and from humanity. She was fighting for herself. The scars on her body would never fade, but that didn't matter anymore. They were just marks of a journey, a story of pain and survival. The future was hers to shape, and no one, not even the invaders, could take that away from her. As the sun set behind her, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Lyra stood tall, ready for whatever came next. She was no longer the girl with the scars. She was a warrior. And she was ready to fight for the future. Lyra stood in front of the makeshift command center, her heart racing with both excitement and fear. Today, they were finally going to move forward with the plan, an attack on one of the invaders' supply bases that had been supplying weapons and resources to their forces. The resistance had been planning this for weeks, and now, the time had come to put everything on the line. The pressure of the mission weighed heavily on her shoulders, but there was something else, too, a sense of purpose. This was her chance to prove that she was more than just a survivor. She could fight, and she would. The others were preparing for the mission, checking weapons and supplies, ensuring that everything was in order. Lyra had learned how to use the basic tools of war, guns, knives, and even the more complex explosives that they would need for the mission. But she wasn't just focused on the weapons. She had learned to focus on the details, the timing, the strategy, the teamwork. The battle wasn't just about fighting, it was about doing it with precision, with a plan. Kale approached her, his expression unreadable as always. He had been a soldier for longer than Lyra had known, and he understood the weight of the mission. He knew how easy it was to doubt oneself, especially in a fight like this. But there was something about the way he looked at her now that gave her confidence. He didn't look at her like the girl with scars. He looked at her like a soldier. "You ready?" Kale asked, his voice steady like it always was before battle. Lyra nodded, wiping her hands on her pants, trying to shake off the nerves. "Ready as I'll ever be." Kale gave her a small smile, his eyes softening just a bit. "You've come a long way, Lyra. You're not the same person who first stepped into the training grounds. I know you'll do well." She met his gaze, grateful for his words, but the nerves were still there, churning in her stomach. The fear wasn't gone, it never would be, but it wasn't as overwhelming anymore. She had learned how to live with it, how to use it as fuel rather than letting it control her. "We need to move out in 10, Kale said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "Get your gear and meet us outside." Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her weapons as she strapped them on. She wasn't just carrying the weight of her past anymore, she was carrying the weight of the future of the people who were counting on her. She couldn't afford to fail. The team gathered outside, ready to head out. It was still early in the morning, the sky a dull gray, the sun barely peeking through the clouds. The air was thick with the smell of dust and smoke, the remnants of past battles. The city, once a place of life and energy, had become a battlefield. But Lyra was no longer afraid of it. She had learned to find strength in the destruction. It was a place where survivors like her could rebuild, where they could take back what had been stolen. Kale motioned for the team to move out, and they began their journey toward the supply base. They moved quickly and quietly through the streets, careful not to make any unnecessary noise. The path was dangerous, filled with the remnants of the alien forces that had once occupied the area. They had to be cautious. One wrong move, and the whole mission could be compromised. Lyra kept her eyes focused ahead, her body tense and alert. She could hear the soft shuffle of feet around her, the rustle of clothing, the sound of weapons being adjusted. She didn't need to look to know that her team was ready. They had all been through this before, and they had all made the decision to fight. There was no turning back now. They reached the outskirts of the base in a little over an hour. The area was quiet, too quiet. Lyra's nerves kicked up again as they crouched behind a row of abandoned vehicles, scanning the area. The supply base was heavily guarded, but there were gaps in their defense. That's where they would strike. Kale gave the signal and the team split up, moving in different directions. Lyra followed Kale, staying close to him as they snuck past the perimeter. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed forward, focusing on the mission on the steps ahead of her. They were getting closer. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a crack of metal, followed by the unmistakable whir of a sentry robot turning toward them. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had to act fast. Without thinking, she dropped to one knee, aiming her weapon at the robot. The rest of the team followed suit, aiming their weapons at the guards and taking them out with quick, precise shots. The sentry robot was no match for them, and it quickly fell to the ground with a loud crash. "Move!" Kale hissed, his voice urgent. The team surged forward, quickly but quietly, making their way to the heart of the supply base. They had reached the supply storage area, a large building surrounded by more guards and automated defenses. The entrance was heavily fortified, but Lyra had seen it before. She knew where the weak points were. She could do this. They approached the door, and Lyra set to work, quickly placing the explosives she had learned to handle so well. The seconds felt like minutes as she adjusted the charges, carefully calculating the timing. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. If this didn't go right, everything they had worked for would be for nothing. "Ready," Lyra whispered, stepping back as she triggered the detonation. The explosion was deafening. The door blew off its hinges, and the shockwave sent a gust of dust and debris into the air. For a moment, everything was chaos. Lyra's heart raced as they rushed inside, the sound of their boots pounding against the concrete floor filling her ears. She kept her head low, her fingers tight around her weapon, moving with purpose. Inside, the guards were scrambling, trying to respond to the breach. But they were too late. Lyra and her team took them out with military precision, moving quickly and decisively. They were a well-oiled machine now, no longer just survivors. They were soldiers. Lyra felt the shift inside her as she pulled the trigger, her movements smooth, confident. She was part of this. She was a fighter. They made their way deeper into the base, where the supplies were stored. It was a large warehouse filled with weapons, food, and medical supplies, everything the invaders had been using to keep their grip on Earth. Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was what they had been fighting for. This was the beginning of the end. Kale gave the signal to stop, and the team gathered around the supply crates. They began gathering what they needed, taking as much as they could carry. Lyra worked quickly, her mind focused on the task at hand. The mission was a success. They had breached the base, and now they were taking back what was theirs. Suddenly, a voice came over the loudspeaker, loud and sharp. "Intruders detected. All units deploy." Lyra's blood ran cold. They were not alone anymore. The base's full defense systems were now activated, and they had just a few minutes before the whole base would be swarming with enemy soldiers. "We need to go now," Kale shouted. Without hesitation, the team dropped what they were doing and rushed back toward the exit. Lyra's heart raced again, and the pressure of the mission hit her all at once. She couldn't afford to fail now, not when they were this close. They made it to the exit, but as they moved into the open, they were met with resistance. More invader soldiers, more machines, all closing in on them. Lyra gritted her teeth, raising her weapon as they took cover behind the debris. The fight wasn't over yet. She didn't have time to think. She was in the moment now, reacting to every movement, every sound, every shot. She felt the weight of her weapon, the sting of fear in her chest, but she also felt the rush of purpose, the certainty that she was where she needed to be. She was no longer the girl with scars. She was a warrior, and she would fight until the end. As the battle raged on, Lyra pushed forward, determined to finish what they had started. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for a future, and nothing would stop her from seeing it through. The mission was over, but the battle was far from won. Lyra stood on the edge of the destroyed supply base, her breath heavy, her body covered in dust and grime. The victory felt bittersweet. They had achieved their goal. They had taken down the invaders' supply base, destroyed their weapons, and freed valuable resources for the resistance. But the cost was evident in the broken bodies of their comrades and the smoke rising from the wreckage. Lyra surveyed the scene. The landscape was scattered with debris, the remnants of the invaders' forces, and the aftermath of their fight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of smoke filled her nostrils. It was a familiar scent, one she had come to associate with war, yet today it was different. There was a sense of finality in the air, as if they had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Kale was beside her, scanning the area, his eyes sharp and alert. He had been by her side throughout the battle, guiding her, pushing her when she thought she couldn't go any further. He had been a constant presence, a reminder that they were in this together. And despite everything, despite the scars that marked her past, Lyra had found herself trusting him more than she had trusted anyone in a long time. "You did well," Cale said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of exhaustion in it. The battle had taken its toll on them all. Lyra nodded, though her eyes were still focused on the destruction around them. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel like a hero. All she could see were the faces of the fallen, the comrades who had fought alongside them and never made it out. It was a grim reminder of the cost of freedom, of the price of rebellion. She couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. "I could have done more," Lyra said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We could have saved more." Cale turned to her, his expression unreadable. "No one can save everyone," he said, his words calm but firm. "This war, this fight, it's not about saving everyone. It's about fighting for what's worth saving, and you fought for that." Lyra didn't respond. The words felt empty to her, like a hollow promise. She had seen the faces of the fallen, the ones who hadn't made it out, and those images wouldn't leave her mind any time soon. They had given their lives for a cause they believed in. She couldn't let their sacrifice be forgotten, but she also couldn't ignore the heavy feeling in her chest, the feeling that no matter how many victories they won, it would never be enough. They gathered the supplies from the base, loading them onto transport vehicles that had been brought in after the battle. The resistance had a lot to do now, more battles to fight, more ground to reclaim. Lyra knew this was only one step in a long, difficult journey. But as she looked around at the faces of her comrades, the people who had fought with her, she realized something. Despite the pain, despite the loss, they were still standing. They had survived. They had fought, and they had won. It was more than she could say for so many others. As they moved toward the transport vehicles, Cale walked alongside her. He had been by her side throughout the mission, but now something had changed. The battle had ended, but Lyra could feel the weight of what lay ahead, the future. It wasn't just about fighting. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about what they would do with the world they had fought for. "Do you think we'll win this?" Lyra asked, her voice almost lost in the wind. Cale didn't answer right away. He looked at her, his eyes dark with thought before speaking. "We will," he said simply. "We have to." Lyra nodded, but the doubt still lingered. She had seen the invaders' power, their weapons, their armies. How could they possibly defeat something so vast, so powerful? She had fought hard, but it felt like a never-ending cycle. Each victory led to another battle, and there was no end in sight. But Cale's words stuck with her. They had to win. They had to fight for the future, for the people who still believed in the possibility of a better world. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding, about creating something worth fighting for. The team moved toward their next destination, the sky darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cold, the wind picking up as night fell. Lyra kept her head down, lost in thought as the vehicles rolled forward. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could face it. She had a purpose now, a reason to fight, and that reason went beyond her own survival. They set up camp outside a small town that had been untouched by the invasion. It was quiet, peaceful even, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. Lyra sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames comforting her as she stared into the flickering light. The other members of the resistance gathered around, talking quietly, tending to their wounds and sharing stories of the mission. But Lyra didn't join in. She didn't feel like talking. Cale sat beside her, his expression thoughtful as he watched the others. "You've come a long way, Lyra," he said quietly. She glanced at him, meeting his gaze. "I don't feel like it. I still feel like I'm the same person." "You're not," Cale said firmly. "You've changed. You've learned to fight to survive, but more importantly, you've learned what it means to stand for something. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone." Lyra shook her head, the words feeling too big for her to accept. "I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I can be what they expect me to be." Cale looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You don't have to be what anyone expects. You just have to be what you need to be, and that's enough." Lyra sat in silence, letting his words sink in. She didn't have all the answers, but maybe that was okay. Maybe she didn't need to be everything at once. Maybe all she had to do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. And with the support of her team, with the support of people like Cale, maybe she could become something more than just the girl with scars. As the fire crackled, Lyra looked up at the stars above. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly in the night. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a world where things were different. A world where the fighting had stopped, where the scars of the past were healed, and where humanity could rebuild itself. It felt like a dream, but it was a dream worth fighting for. She had been through so much. She had fought, had survived, and now she was ready to do more. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and that was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. There would be more battles, more struggles, but Lyra was ready. She had her scars, but they didn't define her anymore. They were just a part of her journey, and as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep moving forward, for herself, for the future. For the world that could be rebuilt, she stood up looking at Kale. "Let's keep going." Kale nodded, his expression a mix of pride and determination. "We will," and together they would.